Is this the region? This the soil, the clime? Said then the lost archangel. This the seat that we must change for heaven. This mournful gloom for that celestial light? Be it so, since he who is sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right. Furthest from him is best, whom reason hath equaled, forth hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell, happy fields where joy forever dwells. Hail horrors, hail infernal world, and thou profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor. One who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ontological Shock. I'm one of your hosts, Nathan Voss.
Shinobi Depp, Darkness and Death.
Thank you for that lovely reading.
Yeah, man.
That brings to mind in listening to that, Dr. Daniel Ingram talks about the nature of spiritual realization as having to do with a state that is equally at peace in heaven or hell. It's not a matter of creating a set of conditions in which it's always heaven. It's a matter of, kind of being disidentified in that.
Because that's what people want, right? Most beings want to seek pleasure and avoid pain all the time.
Yes.
But that's not a very workable model on how to lead your life, because life is so full of pain, disappointment, etc.
It's one of the 8 worldly dharmas, is it? No, it's 2 of the 8 worldly dharmas. It's one of the sets. Those in the Buddha Dharma, there are what are called the 8 spiritual downfalls, and basically, those are seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, seeking fame and avoiding disgrace, seeking praise and avoiding blame. And earlier in the series comes seeking material goods and seeking to avoid losing them. And these are supposed to be the antithesis of the spiritual life and a source of spiritual destruction if sought as ends in themselves, and as the object of spiritual liberation. And yet these are the venerated goals which form the foundation of the society we live in.
The acquisition of material thing, mostly.
Yes. And today we're on here to talk about a topic which is very dear to our hearts, and yet which, I'm not sure we know exactly how to articulate.
First of all, we got to talk about this background. Mm-hmm. The god Gustave Doré, was he a Renaissance painter, or what did he do?
I don't know.
Woodcutter, one of those guys. Anyway, Gustave Doré, this is probably Satan talking to his legions at Pandemonium in hell. It's very representative of what we're talking today, which is spiritual darkness.
Yes, indeed. We're talking about spiritual darkness because, as you may have noticed, if you've tuned into this show before, we are in love with the black void and that which is opposed to all things. How would you put it?
Wow, that's pretty far to say. Maybe we could talk about the darkness for a little bit.
Yeah, what does that mean?
This is great because this will lead into it. A lot of people are, the darkness is everywhere. A lot of people don't like it, don't like to identify with it. But, I guess it's more religious people secular people maybe don't have much of this care about it to identify or disidentify with it. But what is the darkness? You know, when we say darkness, it's just some, as Matt said before, some stupid goth thing, some goth guy crying about, I don't know, whatever he said. He was trying to make fun of goth people. But the darkness, you know, it's everything our parents warned us against, right?
Well, I think that gets kind of to the point. I was reflecting on this recently, and the thought came to me that the process of waking up, as we've experienced it, has a lot to do with the progressive realization that virtually everything, or a great many of the things that one is told is good, laudable, desirable, virtuous, justified, are actually anything but.
Like what?
Like, a lot of the values that our society upholds, like,
The biggest one. Let's talk about the biggest one. Obedience.
oh, yeah, sure. Oh,
That's what they teach us everywhere, every step of the way, right? You go to school. It's actually I went to a Christian school, and it was actually a grade. I don't think they do this in public school, but they do this in Christian schools. On your report card, they have an obedience grade. And if you're obedient to your teacher, you know, you get a better grade. I always had a problem with this because I was always I'm a talkative person, as you people can have surmised. But I always got bad grades in obedience because I was always talking and shit like that. But that's a very high Christian trait, being obedient to God ultimately, right? But, you know, this was a school where you're teaching secular topics as well as theological ones. And so it's all one thing. But obedience is very important for a lot of society. Christianity, which we both grew up with, as well as society, right? You go to school, and what do you have? You have to do everything the teacher says. You can't really deter from the set courses. Everything is done for you. You're just supposed to consume whatever, intellectually, whatever the teachers and the administrators have set forth from you. I remember I saw some Hillary Clinton quote. Remember? It was like she talked about.
oh, she's talking about what was that? The Trilateral Commission or the Council on Foreign
not that one. She talked about the goal of the state was to inculcate your children, was to teach them everything, and it was something like that.
The goal of the state.
It was the responsibility is of the state to teach children what they need to know. I'm paraphrasing.
You know, it brings me back. One of the things I was fond of in childhood and adolescence was being told, "You have a spirit of rebellion," and that is, as in, like, you're infested with a demonic force, which is the impetus of rebellion.
What was the name of the spirit? The spirit that the spirit that talked to Socrates.
Oh,
people should talk about that more, man.
People talk about it, but the thing is, philosophy attempts to position itself as the repudiation of everything that doesn't fit within the modern concept of rationality. And the reality is that philosophy, the history of philosophy, is permeated by mysticism.
Talk about it.
Well, for example, Socrates had this sign that would come to him. There was this spiritual entity with which he was in communication, and he called it daemonion. And daemonion, he says, would give him a sign when he should not say something, when he should not do something. And in the end of his life, when he was on trial, or when they were trying to put him to death, the sign did not advise him to do otherwise. And so then to hold his position and to continue defending his role as
even
a gadfly.
even unto death.
even unto death. And I think that if there is a spiritual agency animating those events, then if had Socrates not been put to death, then the dramatic potency of his message and the profound subversive power in it would not have been communicated in the same way.
That's tragic. It seems like you're saying that his death is almost necessary.
All beings,
martyrdom. This sounds like martyrdom.
All beings die.
Yeah, but this sounds like martyrdom, which is
Yeah,
different
well, the
than
thing is-
dying in your bed at 80
I've
as
talked
a
about-
as a famous philosopher.
Look, I've talked about this before in the show. I think that they were right that Socrates is dangerous, because when you encourage people to question the definitions of the accepted terms which form the bedrock of the collective worldview, then they have begun to dismantle the source code of the matrix. And when that happens, then you were saying it before when we were inside of Starbucks, and you were saying, and we were hating on it, as you would expect. Of course, as is our
That's
civic
all we
duty.
do, man.
That's yes.
Everything is a polemic. That's all you get from us. That's all you get from us.
Yet
Don't expect nothing else.
But you yourself were saying this is all held together by belief.
Belief is the mortar of the society. People go along with everything. There are no, I mean, we have rules, but we're all autonomous individuals, right? I can do it. We can all basically, especially in America, freedom, America, right? You can basically do whatever you want. But there's this giant machine of propaganda that exists everywhere. It's like this panopticon that tells us everything we should believe, and it's everywhere. Everywhere you go, there's an advertisement. Well, maybe just because we're living in New York City. When you venture outside of this tri-state area, there are less advertisements. But still, the television, right? Most people watch television, and we've said this point before. Television is mostly advertisements, right? You watch a show, but the advertisements comprise about at least 50% of the actual programming time. So, people, and a lot of people don't realize it. It's just advertising. They have a direct line into your brain, right? They're feeding this idea of whatever they want directly into your brain. And, sometimes there's PSAs besides, normal commercials for companies and things like that. So it's a giant system of I don't want to say mind control. That sounds too crazy.
Why don't you say mind control? Because let me tell
manipulation.
you,
It's definitely
I'll jump
manipulation.
into this because the truth is,
tag you in.
The truth is that from the time that you're a child, they have you for 6 hours a day, and the nominal purpose that they have you in there for is to give you the ability to function. But what they're really doing is that they're putting these programs so that they can mold you into a certain type of creature.
And what kind of creature is that?
It is a creature that has utility to the system. But I'll tell you this, the schools got you for 6 hours a day, and then children, I don't know about now because they got the smartphones and they've got the social media, but children would sit and they would watch the television for an additional 4 hours. And then if you're particularly unlucky, then on the week, and you'll be taken to some form of mainstream religion. And so most of your life consists in people attempting to encode their doctrines and to create you as a living vessel for the continuance of their beliefs and the bringing about of their objectives. So to shrink from calling it mind control, and it may not be best to call it mind control, but I feel
it's a little heavy-handed. Maybe
I
not.
would
Maybe
toy with
not.
the idea.
Maybe not.
But that's the thing. The mind control implies something subtle. implicit, something behind the message. And that's just the thing. The surface message is not even the most insidious thing. The presuppositions that frame the explicit content, what is not said, what is always avoided. You know,
The underlying message.
it's a very, very insidious thing. And I've talked about this before, and at the risk of retreading a lot of territory, I do think that to a large extent, this system designs itself. Because when you start talking about mind control, the assumption is
That's kind of scary.
that one is only alluding to the deliberate agency of nefarious beings. But like anything can design itself and bring itself about given an iterative process where it's subject to forces that make it refine itself to replicate better. I think the global system of control is in a way something autonomous, is in a way something that arose via a process like natural selection. And that's not to say that there aren't nefarious agencies, but nevertheless, I think that that is a little bit too much of a simplification. And you know, some people find it problematic to think that there could think that there could be causal agency in systems as opposed to individuals. But I think that's only problematic in as much as if you think it's problematic for brains to do things as opposed to individual neurons. Because what we are, in a sense, is an emerging global mind. You know, the chattering.
So there cannot be any one causal factor when you're speaking of a global mind, especially because we don't all speak the same language, even though English is becoming somewhat of a global language. But there still is there's a lot of isolation still amongst, even much less so with the internet. But even still, there's a lot of things that are, as you said, kind of working in relative isolation from each other, right? Like the Sinosphere, right? China and all those countries that speak Chinese, whatever. That's a completely different worldview, right? They have different politics, they have a different history, different religions, etc. And, you know, I think about this all the time, actually. We live in America, and when you think about American culture, there's like the music, the politics, and all these things. When you turn on the radio, when you turn on the TV, you don't hear any other music, philosophies, histories from anywhere else in the world besides here. And it kind of blows my mind, especially when you think about the capacity of the internet to connect people in very disparate places. It's amazing how these cultures still remain so relatively isolated from each other.
Well, you know, they're like superorganisms. There's a book which I really recommend called The Lucifer Principle by Howard Bloom. And it talks about the process of cultural transformation as being driven by memes and mimetic replication. And it posits that things like the United States are effectively superorganisms, and that their purpose is the propagation of memes, and that human beings are merely carriers for the memes. And just as Dawkins says that genes are selfish, genes don't care what happens to the organism. Genes just use the organism as a means to further their replication. So too do the memes manipulate us.
It sounds like these things are conscious and have some sort of sentience.
But that's just the thing. Whether or not there is some kind of proto-sentience that pervades the totality of the universe, however understood, they don't need to be conscious to have a kind of agency. Think about the NPCs in a video game. They're able to carry out a sequence. But think about, have you ever heard about Conway's Game of Life?
No.
Well, you know, it's something that I like to think about, and it's something that I've found very clarifying and it's one of the precursors. Well, I don't know if it's a historical precursor, but it's a conceptual precursor to being able to kind of entertain the possibility that the universe we inhabit is a simulation. So Conway's game of life is very simple. It starts off creating elementary replicators, and they can either propagate and develop and mutate and evolve, or they can die out. And when you run Conway's game of life, you can set different parameters, and as it develops, they will develop flying things, crawling things. A relatively few parameters can algorithmically execute themselves.
Is this like an RPG, like Dungeons and Dragons, or is this some sort of like?
It looks like Space Invaders, but you would be astonished. You would be astonished at the level of complexity.
Oh, I want to see this, so I can like play this on my computer.
Yes, you can create the unfolding of a virtual simulation.
It's kind of like The Sims, right?
Life. Yes, but they look like Space Invaders characters, but they evolve and they form characteristics, and they can sort of vie against one another in various ways.
What is the telos of this game?
It just runs, and they just develop.
So there is none.
Yeah, it's not really a game proper. Ooh, yes, indeed.
What is the telos of evolution?
Well, is there one? I mean, the evolution as conventionally understood represents, well, it's often thought about as representing the repudiation of teleology, although some people, and by some people I don't mean fringe scientists this time, I mean people say that, you know, the banishment of all teleological language from discussion of nature might kind of miss the point, because you can't have telos without a designer, really, but that's beside the point. So why was I talking about Conway's game of life? Oh, the simulation, and thinking about what in the world were we talking about? Well, anyway,
I don't know why you brought up the simulation.
It is, well, I wasn't trying to talk about the simulation. I was trying to talk about the game of life. But memes, well, you're talking about it.
Memes
like
and information.
Memes have
agency,
and that's
consciousness, sentience.
Because if you got something that can replicate, and it's going to try to preserve certain forms of complexity, then it can mindlessly. Because think about the gray goo scenario. Okay, you could have.
Oh, this is great.
You could have molecular nanobots, the function of which is to take apart other organic matter at the molecular scale and build more of these gray molecular nanobots. And basically, the idea is this is a nightmare scenario for nanotechnology, because if you could create something that could break down other types of matter and make more of itself at that scale, and it got out of control, it would not be long before the total surface of the planet was a single homogeneous gray mass. Okay, and you know, that's one of my critiques of capitalism, actually. Parallelism between capitalism and the gray goose scenario, because people often say capitalism is the most efficient system ever devised. And that may be true.
Efficient at what? We've already done
yes,
that.
Efficient at what?
Yeah.
Efficient at what? Because the gray goose scenario shows that if you do create the most efficient system of replication conceivable, it can outcompete everything else while creating nothing whatsoever in the way of goodness, truth, or beauty. You know, let's bring it back to the topic of spiritual darkness.
Okay, yeah, that's a good segue. Goodness, truth, and beauty. Something, okay, you have a system that precludes all goodness, truth, and beauty. We've somewhat briefly talked about the topic of what evil is, which we have defined, or maybe someone else has defined as, what is it, entropy with purpose, or no, purposefully
entropy
creating
is
entropy.
The tendency of all systems to disintegrate. Evil is the addition of intention to that process.
There we go.
And that is yet another quote from our buddy Whitley Strieber. Interesting characterization of the worldview that animates this show, that one of the most frequently quoted figures is this alien abductee person. But regardless,
it's a good idea.
It's a good idea.
Regardless of who said it.
On its own
it's a great idea.
merits. Yeah. Okay, so, you know, I was talking about how, you know, why do we like darkness? And I ventured the theory, which I'm going to recap, even though I said it in this very episode mere moments ago, that everything you start to realize that all or a lot of the things you're told are good are actually bad and possibly evil. And many of the things you'd been told are bad turn out to be good. Like, for example, I was told that socialism is bad, right? I was told that Buddhism was demonic. I was told that Hinduism was demonic. I was told that Taoism was demonic. And so, as you come to realize that many of the things that you dislike, that you were made to believe are good, is this transvaluation type thing. And I think that in a way, the satanic archetype and the identification with darkness as a kind of archetypal principle represents a kind of archetypal encoding of that dynamic and an identification with that process. And Nietzsche talked about it in a similar vein where he said that a new good will appear to be an evil from the perspective of the world that it is wiping away.
Yeah, I think even more generally, oh, actually, it's not that general because it's kind of a Jungian idea. But what is the darkness? The darkness is that which is not seen. And what that means a lot for human beings and the human psyche is the things that we don't like, or the things maybe that we don't like about ourselves, the things that are unaccepted in society. But these things don't go away, right? You know, when you tell someone you shouldn't kill someone, you shouldn't molest someone, you shouldn't, I don't know, what else, you have to obey, you shouldn't rebel, you shouldn't think this way, anything you shouldn't do, these impulses don't really go away, right? And a lot of the time, these things are taken and they're internalized and compartmentalized in some sort of maybe safe box somewhere in the back of our brain or our conscious or whatever. And you create this gulf between you, right? Your whatever persona or whatever surface mind that you choose to use to interact with society. And then there's all the nasty stuff that you're not allowed to think about.
Not you.
That is not, supposedly not you, which is still part of your mind that is now segued away, compartmentalized into some other basement, some sort of box in your whatever, soul, body, mind, whatever you want to call it.
Indeed. You know, in a similar vein, Carl Jung has this wonderful quote which says, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." And I'm reminded of a situation that happened where a group of concerned mothers became convinced that the dark forces of secular humanism had conspired to hide pornographic images within the textbooks of elementary schools throughout their school district. And they went through these school textbooks with a microscope and found what they alleged to be images of genitalia of various types and of various crude sex acts.
Oh, no.
And they were even able to get some of the textbooks repealed. And
wow.
But where did those images exist except in their imaginations? And it's a very basic thing in Jungian psychology that we react the most strongly against what we feel within ourselves, but we reject. What the things that we react to in other people in situations and say, that's deplorable, I really can't stand that, very often, because it's something, it reminds us of something about our own being that we do not want to own or accept.
Accept. That's what I was gonna say.
And I think personally, I found, especially over the past couple of years, as I've been moving back into this kind of thing somewhat to a
What
certain
thing?
extent. Well, darkness, or at least a consciousness of that, a conscious use of it, a kind of dharma of the clip-off, if you will.
What happens if? Okay, so let's talk before you do that.
Sure.
So I said you got this gulf between you and this Jungian shadow, the things that are still you.
The persona. Let's not use the word you. The persona is the mask that most people over-identify with, the mask that they present to the world.
And then the shadow, which is all the stuff that you don't want to admit, but that is still very, very present in your being, and that probably animates more of your actions than either A, you consciously know, or would even want to admit. So this gulf still exists. And what happens when you keep putting all these broken toys away into the corner? What's the end result of that? Because these are still a very much part of you, but it's this duality between the persona and the shadow. What happens?
Well, it's like Jung says it. I was just looking for the quote, but I can't find it. But he says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will continue to rule your life, and you will call it fate. And that's everything. And unless you reconcile these other aspects of your being, in a similar, related to this, I think, is an idea that's discussed in Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, which is his recounting of the teachings of the teacher G.I. Gurdjieff. And in one passage, he talks about how there isn't one eye. There is a sequence of eyes. And the actions of one eye, which only comes into being for a moment, can determine the fate of all the others. And in each moment, there is a different eye. And there isn't really one master eye. And that's an interesting articulation of no self. Anytime I find an articulation of no self that's emerged in a, let's call it an alien philosophical context.
Alien
as much as it doesn't necessarily evidence cultural diffusion or explicit interaction with some kind of dharmic understanding.
Okay.
I find that interesting, like reading Hume writing about this, for example, because it gives a different way into the thought that is represented by concepts like no self and emptiness. But there's another passage which is related in Search of the Miraculous, where it talks about conscience. And conscience, they say that levels of conscience are like levels of consciousness. And it talks about how most people couldn't stand for all of the ethics of all of the disparate portions of their being to be present to their awareness at the same time. They would be destroyed by it.
Destroyed?
Right? Well, they would feel a kind of spiritual anguish from which they would seek to escape at the earliest opportunity. And
because of how they had created themselves. And this is an interesting idea. We talked about this. You mentioned this earlier. The identity as being some sort of creation.
And also, our identities have a lot to do with what we reject. They have as much or more to do with what we reject as what we're for.
That's no self right there.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing of no self, man.
Explain.
Your identity, we build our identity off of what we are not, right? So I'm here, and then the world, or what I am not, is over there. And how you have created yourself could not exist unless there was this exclusion of principles, exclusion of traits, because that's what we are, right? What are we? Who is Shinobi? Who is Nate, right?
Imaginary boundary.
Yeah, these are boundaries between you and the world, and everybody's okay. I have these characteristics. I don't have these characteristics, and that's how we define ourselves through exclusion. We talked about this in the definition episode a lot.
Yeah. Defining ourselves through exclusion. And the thing is, the task is to make the darkness conscious.
And that's why we like it so that. And this goes back to the original idea. Why do we like the darkness? Because we recognize that the darkness is a necessary, not even necessary. It's just, these are all, the self is basically these boundaries that we make or that we draw arbitrarily, maybe not. Are these arbitrary? But these are distinctions, exclusions that we make between ourselves. And if you accept your darkness, or even, it's kind of a realization that I am not all here. Part of me is also out there. And then, there's less of this boundary between me and everybody else. And now I see these things that I have rejected are as much as a part of me as the things that I'm told to accept. And then there's a more dynamic free flow between these various modules of the self, of your drives, as of animal drives, also whatever else human beings are. Maybe people would say the drives towards transcendence, creativity, etc. Right? So there's more of a inclusion now. Instead of creating the self as a completely exclusive process, now our self is more of an inclusive process, which is far less kind of, forgive me, schizophrenic. That's a bad word to use. But you probably can take my meaning from that.
Sure.
And that's why we like the darkness, because it is part of ourselves. And now, so it's basically like, oh, okay, all this stuff was here. And now I'm like, okay, how can I use this and make it a part of me? How can I make it work for me? All of this stuff that I want to throw away and reject. And let's be 100 here. Let's be truthful. Much of human history is about the darkness, right? Most of human history is violence, rape, genocide, pillaging, destruction on massive scales, and that not always, but usually ascribes to what is considered to be dark or the darkness. So, we have, not that we have to worship it. We don't have to worship it, but it's an acceptance of it as a personal reality and as a kind of a larger human reality.
Yes. Something Jordan Peterson said toward the end of his debate with Slavoj Žižek, which I really appreciated, is that the amount of light one is able to experience is directly proportional to the amount of darkness that one is willing to forthrightly confront. And I think that there really is a synergistic relationship with that. And it's very true in my own life. I think that I've experienced more darkness in the way of violence, calamity, deprivation, and other misfortune.
Chaos.
Yes, chaos,
disorder,
than most. And I think in consequence of that, out of a sort of pregnant dialectical friction that arises through the direct confrontation with darkness, that there can arise a more profound apprehension of the whole. It reminds me of a conversation I had a long time ago. I was fortunate for a brief period, a couple of times, to talk to Alex Gray, the visionary artist. And I was asking him about the period in his own personal life where he had been a nihilist, and he had only made nihilistic art, where he would use corpses and defiled dogs and embryos. And basically all of his art was about the meaninglessness and the futility and the comic brevity of our pitiful embodied existence.
And
right?
also this kind of omnipresence of entropy, death, violence,
yeah,
and decay,
entropy. Yes, death, violence,
and
decay.
kind of a reverence of that.
So I was talking to him about his emergence from nihilism, which incidentally occurred when an angelic being named Mr. Lewis appeared to him. But I was asking him about overcoming nihilism. How does one overcome nihilism? And it was one of those turning point conversations, in the sense that it's something I thought back on and reflected on. And what emerged from the conversation was the insight that nihilism basically poses a challenge to spirit, which in this Wilberian sense, which is kind of is the background of his vocabulary, I guess, spirit being the consciousness of the universe, the emerging telos, the eros of being striving toward the infinite. Nihilism is a challenge to spirit to display more of its profundity. So that was a turning point conversation in as much as it informed some of my later ability to appreciate things like the Tibetan distinction between the path of faith and the path of reason. Recall that according to the Tibetans, there are practitioners of the path of faith who follow the Dharma, although this doesn't have to be about the Dharma. This could be about any spiritual teaching because it sounds nice, because it appeals to them intuitively. And then there are the practitioners of the path of reason. And the practitioners of the path of reason are the ones who have the capacity to realize the teachings in the sense of becoming spiritually liberated, becoming awakened, because the teachings can only display their truth when you question them to their very foundations, and not merely as a pedagogical exercise, like, oh, I'm going along with this, but really seek to tear them to their foundations. And then the profound reality of emptiness can become apparent. But in order to...
In your own life, in your own experience.
Yeah, but you need to be committed to truth. And in a sense, even Vipassana, which isn't an intellectual thing, it's about, observing phenomena as they arise, which is speed, precision, inclusiveness, and seeing the true nature of them, and seeing their transience, seeing their dissatisfactoriness, seeing that none of them are you, moment by moment. That's a kind of commitment to truth. It's a different kind of commitment to truth. And so the commitment to truth needs to be like xenomorph blood. The commitment to truth needs to burn through everything. And burning through, and they say that the swiping of the sword of Manjushri, after that, only that which is real remains. That has to be the commitment,
Preach.
Indeed.
So, we don't want you people to think we're just some sort of blind black magician devil worshippers. I mean, maybe that's part of it.
People do mean different things by black magician. By black magician, there are people
I wouldn't have to go into this.
who mean that they are creating their own values. Because the way it works in that type of lexicon is that a right-hand person is someone who accepts a system of values which is given to them. I mean, like any term, it's polymorphous, and like any term in religion, it'll take on different understandings in different cultural contexts.
Yeah, but there's an overall context of black magic. If you ask anybody what black magic is, everybody knows what black magic is, right? It's all the nasty stuff that you do to people. It's communing with entities which are not nice, unstable, demons, ghosts, all these imps, goblins, all this nasty stuff, right? But what I meant to say was, it's not a devotion to this. This is, as I said before, this is a reintegration of what is rejected in conventional morality, which is in the West is largely Christian. And in this reintegration, you see all of these things kind of for what they are, as a extension of your own being and not something separate from it. And that's why we like it, because it is part of who we are, who we all are. It's a part of human history, and it'll always be. The darkness will always have a place in the human heart, in the human psyche, in the human mind. And we need to get over that. We have to accept that and
Well, is
find
that
ways
something-
to work with it.
Is that something everybody can do? Is that something everybody should do? Because to work directly with darkness.
Okay, we can talk about this. This is good. Why is this dangerous? Why is the shadow
Or is it something
dangerous?
universal? You know, because that's the thing. Everyone needs to integrate their shadow as part of a matter of basic psychological health.
Basic? I don't know if that's a basic.
Well, I mean, a part of
If
psychological
you go to
health
your freaking
generally.
therapist, they're not going to tell you to do that work.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, you do need to integrate the parts of your experience, the elements of your psyche that you've disowned, because a lot of the internal contradiction is in not identifying with these elements of yourself and seeing them only coming at you from the world. And that's something I think everybody has to do. But when you talk about working with darkness, when you talk about like darkness as a part of one's path,
Well, that would be a working with it. If you accept something fully in your spirit, and as I've said, that it's part of you. And this is a personal belief. I believe this darkness is in every person. I also believe that the light is in every person, right? It's not a
at the same
dichotomy.
time, I feel like
it's not a dichotomy.
It's still a little bit of a problematic formulation, and I think.
What do you mean?
It's a little bit of a problematic formulation because it sounds dualist. It sounds like a kind of Manichaean, Zoroastrian holdover.
But
and-
that's what most people believe, man.
Yes, but at the same time, I think really.
We're not starting from zero, man. We're starting from the history of Western civilization as we live here. And Christianity is the elephant in the room, and for us at least, in our circles. And you have to talk about it. Yes, it does seem Manichaean, and maybe it is. But who's not so dualist? Most people on the street you talk to,
People
will
are
say,
dualists.
Thank you. People say, "Oh, I don't want any negativity. Negativity is bad." It's a big thrust in common culture, meme culture.
There was a lunatic who attempted to invite himself onto the show, who, when we said, if you're going to be on this show, this is grounded in some very specific readings of some texts, and you should have some background in this and that. He's like, no, I understand. And he's like, only light can come from light, and only darkness can come from darkness. And
Exactly, man. That dualism is everywhere. It's everywhere, man.
yeah, it is, but at the same time,
You have to, you have to. I don't want to say respect. Respect is the wrong word, but accept that is the kind of the cultural vector trajectory that we've been on for thousands of years, and you can't just erase it, wipe it out. We're on a process, right, of this. That's what the reintegration of the shadow is. It's saying, okay, this is what society said, this is what culture and religion has said. Now, where am I in 2019? How do I move forward? How do I approach psychology and spirituality? Because you have all of these things that you have to deal with, that we've had in our minds, that we've rejected. We talked about this in the apostasy episode. So you have to work. I think that you have to not respect, but accept that these things exist most places in definitely the Western mind, and doing only by accepting the fact that this is the reality of the matter can you move forward and maybe have this truthful discussion about the reintegration of this nastiness and how to navigate it in a meaningful way that's not just falling into blind passion, rage,
well, that's the
etc.
thing. Well, maybe the most kind of integrated way we could think about it is to put it in a tantric framework, because the idea in Vajrayana Buddhism is that the energies that animate our being aren't intrinsically bad. So things that are usually considered problematic, like the energy behind anger, when it's not filtered through the distorted logic of the ego, meaning when it's not distorted by the misapprehensive of intrinsic existence, and that same Vajra energy is no longer manifest as anger, but as mirror-like wisdom, right? And so for any of these energies, when it's not a matter of replacing one type of energy with another type of energy. It's a matter of seeing through the dualistic intrinsicality.
Yeah, that replacing would just be another form of dualism.
Because the problem is that we're given a dualistic framework in which we're told certain things are simply unacceptable, to the point where when we feel or experience them arising in ourself, we reject portions of our own being and we reject portions of reality. And
that's
in reality,
dangerous.
When you take away the intrinsicality of that value judgment, and in fact, when you take away intrinsicality as such, then there is just the play of phenomena. And then that you see that apparent dualism in actuality is, I just don't want to reinforce a sense of it having a kind of ontological primacy.
What?
Light and darkness. Because it's a very specific, culturally contingent sort of thing. I don't think it's universal that people see things in terms of light and darkness. But, to switch it up entirely, and by the way, we're coming down to the end of the hour, I've heard it claimed by this guy, Timothy, who just goes by Timothy. He's one of the people who runs Become a Living God. That the most discriminated against group in history, in any culture, is the black magician. It is the one group that is hated, reviled, feared, persecuted more than any other group. Anthropologically, I don't know whether that's really true, but it's an interesting claim, and I think it makes an interesting point. Because to work with the forces that exist outside, that are not valorized and or exist outside of the default ontology, is in a way to be dangerous in a way that's complementary to what I was talking about as being philosophically dangerous.
I think it would be more general than to say the black magician, than to say the shaman or the spirit worker is feared because of their existence. They exist, where do they exist? Do they exist in the human world? Do they exist in the spirit world? No, they exist in between. They exist they exist in the liminality between both worlds. And as such, most normal people do not have any dealings with this otherness. And as such, you fear what you do not know, what you cannot understand.
Yeah.
So I think it's much wider than to say the black magician. This is the person who lives on the fringes of existence itself. They say you have one foot in one world and one foot in the other world.
Yeah. This got me thinking about something we were discussing earlier. You were explaining to our buddy Matt that Lovecraft was very xenophobic. And we were postulating that Lovecraft's ability to write about these horrible, unspeakable, ineffable monstrosities had to do with his fear of the unknown. And I said, if I were going to contrast my attitude with Lovecraft's.
Uh-oh. Here's a turn, baby. Here we go.
Instead
Ready?
Instead of being xenophobic, I would call myself a xenophiliac.
Xenophilia. You heard it here for the first time, folks. Ontological shock. Xenophilia. He's a xenophiliac.
Are you not?
That's a good question. What is a xenophiliac? Let's talk about that.
Well, you gave the etymologies before.
Xenos, Greek, this means unknown. And as we all know, philia means love of. So this means the love of the unknown. So do I like all things weird?
Well, think of
yes.
Demons, aliens,
These are everything that is not accepted by normalcy.
Yes.
So yes, I guess I'm a xenophiliac.
Have you
too.
seen any of these episodes? Have you listened? Yes. So basically, ontological shock can be summarized as the philosophical exploration of xenophilia.
It sounds so lurid. Maybe it sounds more lurid than it actually is.
I'll take it as lurid as I can get. So on that note, maybe we will conclude.
That sounded more erotic than it should have.
Well, another thing that I like to
H.R.
identify
Geiger.
with is the path of the Agori, who in their passion for connecting with God, which is not the demiurgic illusion, which is generally elevated as God, but God in the sense of the ultimate creative potency and animating creative power, which may or may not exist as the impetus of all manifestation, life, and consciousness. In their zeal for God, they seek God in death, in corpse, in sexual congress with corpses, in consuming flesh and excrement. And I think there's something profoundly beautiful and important about that.
It's the most radical expression of the integration of all things nasty.
It's true.
It's radical.
And we like those guys to the extent that we've toyed with the idea of creating a Dharma center called Agori Dharma. And part of the idea being that inasmuch as the Agori are to the rest of the Indian sadhus someone feared, what that would be with respect to the rest of the Dharma community would have a similar dislocation, and we like those guys. We think they're cool, and in our own tepid way, we aspire to be like them. I don't think I have it in me to consume feces, much less as
I don't
human
know,
flesh.
man. If you sit on the Ganges for 10 years,
I don't want to sit out there just eating out of a skull for like forever and drinking urine. I admire it.
They can eat other stuff. They eat other stuff, man.
I admire it.
They can eat a hamburger. But see, that's it. They can eat a hamburger. They don't just. They're
How often do they eat a hamburger? We're at 57.
Come on, man. That was rhetorical.
Well, look. On that note,
they could eat a hamburger as well as they could eat a feces. Their entire diet is not feces, man. That's what I was trying to say.
Their entire diet is not.
We see that and we're like, whoa, these guys eat feces. Maybe they only eat feces.
Indeed. Well, look. On that note,
what a great end.
A truly great end. This has been another edition of Ontological Shock. I am your host, Nathaniel Voss.
Shinobi Depp, Darkness and Death.
And we'll see you next time on Ontological Shock.